Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our Domestic Violence Awareness Month speaker series. This is our first of four webinars in the series, and we're so excited to have you here today. I think we'll just wait a couple more moments as folks get ready and get settled, and we'll go from there with our presentation. All right, everyone, it is 12 o'clock on the dot. Just want to thank you all again for joining us for our Domestic Violence Awareness Month speaker series. Like I mentioned, this is our very first webinar in the speaker series, and we're happy to have you here today. My name is Lauren Gorlick. I serve as Community Relations Coordinator for Haven House. We will begin this presentation in a couple minutes, and we will be ending the presentation at about 1 o'clock. But first, I'd like to get going on a couple of housekeeping items. We are so grateful to have this speaker series, and it's been sponsored by Alexandra Professionals. We're grateful for their support and for the support of many other companies and businesses who have sponsored this speaker series. So thank you very much. There is a link to Alexandra Professionals in the chat function. You can find their services there. There's also a link to Haven House in the chat function too. Through the Haven House website link, you'll also find our hotline number. It's 884-6000, and my colleagues are available to take any calls that you may have, not only for personal situations, but for friends and loved ones that maybe you have some questions about as well. The hotline is always available. We will be recording this webinar, so anything you do mention in the chat function will be recorded as well for future broadcasts. So without further ado, I am going to introduce today's speaker, Sara Grady. Sara is the director of Haven House. She oversees, her title really is the Intervention and Prevention of Domestic Violence Services for Child and Family Services. She joined us here today as our director. So Sara, thank you so much for joining us. We have a lot to unpack with this topic. So without further ado, I'll let you begin.
Thanks, Lauren. So as Lauren mentioned, my name is Sara Grady, and I am the Director for Domestic Violence Prevention and Intervention Services at Child and Family Services, Haven House. And today we are excited to have our first in our speaker series, shining a light on domestic violence. So today during our webinar, we are going to talk about Haven House, who we are and what we do. We're going to talk about domestic violence, what domestic violence is, give you an idea about statistics. What does domestic violence look like in the United States? What are the different types of abuse that are part of domestic violence? Some high risk factors, talking a little bit about abusers and perpetrators and why victims might stay. We're also going to share with you what you can do if someone close to you discloses that they are experiencing domestic violence. And we'll also talk about community resources and answer any questions that you might have. Throughout the presentation, you can share any questions through the Q&A function, which should be at the top or bottom of your screen labeled as Q&A. So you can go ahead and type any questions. And at the end of the presentation, if we haven't answered your questions, Lauren will let me know what you've asked and we will answer them for you. So first, let's talk about Haven House. So Haven House is the domestic violence services component of Child and Family Services. We are most well known in the community, I think, for our shelter. We have a 36-bed shelter. We are the only licensed domestic violence shelter here in Erie County. And our shelter serves domestic violence victims of all gender identities and their dependent children. Anywhere from 30 to 50% of our census on average is usually children. So we have a specialized children's program within our shelter as well. We also offer 6 transitional housing units as a part of our programming that assist victims who are transitioning to permanent housing but may have other goals that they need to accomplish before they're ready to be out on their own, building their new life free of violence. And so they can receive more intensive support through the transitional housing program. Now, all of our residential services are geared towards domestic violence victims who are right now experiencing domestic violence and experiencing safety concerns related to their domestic violence. But we also offer non-residential services that are available to anyone who has experienced domestic violence in their lifetime. And our non-residential services include supportive counseling, support groups, art empowerment, domestic violence education and parenting after violence groups and one-on-one services, legal and court advocacy in 16 towns, jurisdictions, and courts throughout Erie County, economic empowerment services for folks experiencing financial abuse, which we'll talk more about later in the presentation, and rapid rehousing services and supports to assist victims who are fleeing domestic violence in receiving case management and financial assistance in getting their own permanent housing away from their perpetrators. Now, to access any of Haven House's many services, you can just contact us 24/7 through our hotline 884-6000 or through our web chat, which you can find at cfsbny.org. You can either follow the direct link or just go to our main page and search chat, and the chat link will pop right up. So let's talk about what domestic violence, or DV, is. So domestic violence is a pattern of coercive behavior where one individual uses fear and intimidation to gain and maintain power and control over another closely related individual. So the key pieces of this are a pattern of coercive behavior, the use of fear and intimidation, and the goal of power and control. And these are the most key pieces when you're looking at the definition of domestic violence. Now, when most folks think about domestic violence, or DV, they typically think of intimate partner violence, which is a type of domestic violence that occurs between two individuals who are in an intimate or romantic relationship. So typically, when folks are thinking about DV, this is what they're thinking about. But domestic violence can occur between other closely related individuals, including children against elder parents, parents against children, different family members against one another. It's important to know that domestic violence can happen to anyone. Domestic violence does not discriminate and happens to folks of all ages, all races, all socioeconomic statuses, all gender identities, and all cultures. However, what we do know is that domestic violence victims are primarily women and perpetrators are primarily men. So throughout today's presentation, I'm going to use the term victim and survivor interchangeably to talk about the individuals who experience the domestic violence, who have the violence acted on them. And I'm also going to interchangeably use perpetrator and abuser to talk about the person who is committing the domestic violence against the victim or abuser. You also might hear me use she or her pronouns to talk about victims, or he or him pronouns to talk about perpetrators. But again, I just want to reinforce that even if I use this language, it doesn't mean that all victims are women or all perpetrators are men, because we know it happens across the spectrum of gender identity. So as I mentioned, in looking at domestic violence in the United States, what we know is that anywhere from 85 to 95% of domestic violence victims are women, but it does impact men and folks of other gender identities. Domestic violence is prevalent and widespread. We know that it impacts 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men at some point in their life, and that number is staggering. But what it means that for folks watching today, even if you don't know for sure, like you have been told, oh, someone in my life has experienced domestic violence, you know a victim or survivor of domestic violence, because those numbers are huge. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men, which means someone in your life has experienced or is experiencing domestic violence right now. We also know that when you're looking at violent crime, domestic violence is 21% of violent crime. So it is, again, a very prevalent issue happening across the nation in all communities to all people. When we're looking at homicide, we know that 1 in 2 women and 1 in 13 men who are murdered by an intimate partner. That's 50% of female homicide victims, which is a huge and staggering number, which is speaking to really the danger of domestic violence, which we'll speak more about. We also know that leaving a relationship that where domestic violence is occurring can be dangerous and difficult. It takes victims on average 7 attempts to leave a domestic violence relationship, and we'll talk more about why that is. And we also know that it can be very dangerous to leave, and 65% of women who are killed by a former intimate partner had ended the relationship within 3 months of their murder. What that lets us know is that time period is dangerous. And again, we'll talk more about that and about resources that are available to victims to help them stay safe while they're leaving. It's also really important to know that folks who are experiencing domestic violence typically share that they're experiencing domestic violence with someone in their life. 84% of female DV victims and 61% of male DV victims tell someone about their abuse, and usually it's a friend or family member. And this is really important to keep in mind because we're going to talk about today what you can do if someone in your life shares that they're experiencing DV, because again, the majority of victims do tell someone about their abuse. So typically when folks think about domestic violence, the image that comes to mind is a beaten or battered woman, bruised and physically assaulted by her abuser. And that is domestic violence. But domestic violence is much more nuanced than that and is not just physical abuse. There are a lot of different types of abuse and tactics that are used by domestic violence perpetrators to gain and maintain this power and control. They use many different tactics and ways of exerting this power and control and using fear and intimidation to keep their victim in the relationship and to control their victim. When we work with victims, anecdotally, they usually share with us that actually the emotional and psychological abuse has longer lasting impacts for them sometimes than the physical abuse that they experience. So when we're talking about emotional abuse, we are talking about a lot of different tactics that perpetrators use against victims. They will use words to destroy a victim's self-esteem, to humiliate and degrade them. They may undermine their sense of self-worth by criticizing them, belittling them, calling them names. Emotional abuse can also look like withholding affection, refusing to communicate with the partner regularly, and ignoring the needs and feelings that they express in the relationship. And abusers will use these tactics to undermine a victim's self-worth, their self-esteem, and their belief in themselves, which is really important, again, in that ability to be able to maintain power and control over this individual. We also know that domestic violence involves psychological abuse, and a really prevalent tactic that we see with abusers is isolation from family and friends. Because family and friends are often there to support victims and will let them know if they see something going on that doesn't look right to them. So perpetrators will use different tactics to isolate a victim from their friends and family, preventing them from seeing them, sabotaging those relationships, not allowing them to communicate with friends and family, because again, it makes it easier for them to maintain that power and control over the victim if they have less resources and supports. For psychological abuse, we can also see stalking, so constantly checking up on and monitoring a victim, using technology to see who they talk to and when, what they say, where they go, monitoring their every move. It can look like implying restrictions on what victims can wear or do or say, who they can and can't be friends with. They can use psychological abuse by using threats and intimidation against victims, threatening to harm them, threatening to take their children away, threatening to harm or take away their property, blackmailing them with information they may know about them because they are in this intimate relationship. And it can also commonly look like gaslighting. So to give a really basic example of what gaslighting is, you could see a situation where a perpetrator and a victim are in a verbal argument, and the perpetrator might call a victim a really nasty name. And maybe the next day things have cooled down and the victim approaches the abuser and says, "I can't believe you called me that name last night." And in gaslighting, the perpetrator's response would be, "I have no idea what you're talking about. We didn't fight last night. I've never called you that name in my life. You're crazy. You have no idea what you're talking about." And over, when they use this tactic over time, victims will often start to question their own reality. Are they really experiencing abuse? Are the things that they know are happening actually happening? Because this person in their life is questioning all of the things that they know to be true. And then they start to doubt themselves. They start to doubt that what they're experiencing is really happening. And this can be really impactful on victims and their ability to reach out for help. We also see, as I mentioned, economic or financial abuse, and this can be really impactful for victims because it can make it very challenging for them to leave. So economic abuse can look like fostering financial dependency, and what that means is that the perpetrator or abuser controls all of the finances in the home. The victim may be working full-time, have a job, be making money, but all of that money goes to the perpetrator's bank account. The perpetrator makes all choices in the household about how money is spent, how much money is spent, on what items. If the victim wants even $5 to go to the store for milk, they have to ask the abuser for that $5 because they aren't allowed to have their own money or access to their own money. It can look like employment sabotage or not allowing access to work or school. So those can be different tactics. Either an abuser might not allow a victim to work, might ask them to quit or force them to quit school or work, or they may sabotage employment by showing up at the place of employment, calling the victim repeatedly at work, causing a scene at the work site, maybe preventing the victim from going into work and not allowing them to call in appropriately to their jobs. They may be fired. So many different sabotage tactics. And again, this is about that power and control. Oftentimes when victims are at work, abusers don't have eyes on them. They can't see what they're doing or control what they're doing or who they're talking to. So they may sabotage that employment so they have more power and control over the victim. Economic abuse can also look like identity theft tactics. So we see abusers using a victim's identity to take out credit cards, loans, mortgages, running up bills in the victim's name and then not paying them and subsequently destroying their credit. It can also be withholding financial documents. So we all know that in our lives, it's really important to have access to our financial documents, to tax returns, bank statements, credit card statements, and perpetrators may withhold these documents, take control over them, and not allow victims to have access to even basic financial information about themselves. So domestic violence can also be sexual abuse. So it's really important to know that even if a relationship is consensual, not all sexual contact is consensual. You still need consent in a relationship. And so sexual abuse can look like rape in the relationship, date rape or marital rape. We also see perpetrators use forced prostitution with victims, forcing them to have sex with others for goods or money. We can see birth control as a tactic used in domestic violence. Either we have perpetrators not allowing victims to utilize birth control or demanding that they utilize birth control that the victim may not be comfortable with, and otherwise just gaining control over their reproductive health. It can also be undermining a person's sexuality. We've seen situations where victims may identify as gay, lesbian, pansexual, bisexual. Their partner, the perpetrator, has that information, and maybe the victim isn't ready yet to share that information with friends, family, and other loved ones. Their perpetrator may use that and say, if you don't listen to me, if you don't do what I want, if you leave me, I'm going to share this information with the people in your life. I'm going to, in effect, out you when you're not ready to have these discussions with your friends and family. And it can also look like accusations of infidelity, which is often utilized by perpetrators to prevent folks from going out. So maybe they might use that, I love you, I know you're cheating on me every time you leave, which is why I don't let you go out with your friends. I don't let you go see your mom because I know you're really using that as an excuse to cheat on me. And I love you and I love our relationship. So I can't let you leave or see these people because I know this is what you're doing. And then of course, as we talked about, physical abuse. Domestic violence can include physical abuse, inflicting and attempting to inflict bodily harm, punching, slapping, hair pulling, kicking, shoving, utilizing weapons against a victim, using strangulation against a victim, all different forms of physical abuse. But physical abuse can also be withholding resources for someone to maintain their health. So if you're a victim and you rely on a medication for your health, maybe you rely on seeing a specialist, maybe you have a wheelchair that you need access to, your perpetrator may use these things to maintain control over you. You can't have your medications if you don't do what they say, if you don't stay in the relationship. They control when and how you get them, when and how you have access to these resources, when you can go to the doctor, under what circumstances. They might control access to food and water or hygiene products for victims. And again, utilizing this as a tactic to maintain this power and control over the victim. We can also see forcing the use of drug or alcohol on victims by perpetrator. And again, this is just another tactic to maintain that power and control. When someone's under the influence, sometimes it can be easier to exert that power and control. So we'll see abusers utilize that tactic and utilize drug and alcohol use against victims. So with domestic violence, we know from research that if there are certain factors present in a relationship, it makes the relationship more dangerous or more high risk. And what the research shows us is that this higher risk is a higher risk of lethality, or the chance that the perpetrator will murder the victim. So on the screen, you're going to see all of the factors that we understand to be high risk factors, or factors that if they're present in the domestic violence relationship, it means that it is a more dangerous relationship. Here in Erie County, all domestic violence advocates in the county are trained to assess for high risk factors in domestic violence victims, and this is very important. So they are trained to work with victims and assess for these factors, and then to utilize linkages to resources and supports and safety planning to mitigate this risk, to help keep victims who are at high risk of lethality safer. Erie County also has a domestic violence high risk team, which is a multidisciplinary team that includes the DA's office, local law enforcement jurisdictions, probation, parole, the Department of Social Services, and victim services agencies. And this team meets and every month discusses the most high-risk domestic violence cases in Erie County and talks about tactics and supports and resources that can be put in place to keep these victims safe. And the coordinator for the high-risk team in Erie County is housed and employed by Haven House. And so we are participating and doing the work every day to try and keep the highest risk victims for domestic violence in Erie County safe and supported, so that we don't see them ending up in situations where they are harmed or murdered by their partner. So when we talk about abusers and we talk about domestic violence perpetrators, what are some of those characteristics? What do those folks look like? So it's really important to know that it isn't always like it is on television or in the movies where you see the bad guy walking down the street, right? The abuser in the Lifetime movie, and you know that this is a bad guy. Like we talked about, domestic violence happens in all communities, in all races, ethnicities, to people in all different places in their lives. And what that means is that it's really hard to just look at somebody and say, oh, this is definitely a domestic violence abuser, right? So it's not that easy just to identify someone. And abusers are actually, because they're good at this manipulation, really good at hiding the fact that they are a domestic violence abuser. We see folks from all walks of life who are perpetrators. You know, it's not just these folks that you have in your head when you think of a criminal. We see folks in all different occupations, all different ages, like I said, races, all different communities, urban, suburban, and rural, who are domestic violence abusers. But we see some characteristics in common in terms of what these abusers do or some pieces of their personality. So we often see this, again, control that we've talked a lot about. These abusers are very controlling and they exert control over their victims. They are very entitled. So what that means is that they believe that they should have the control in the relationship. They should have control over their victim. They should be allowed to tell the victim what they can wear, where they can go, who they can be friends with. They often look at their own needs over the needs of their partner, right? So I want control. I want to be able to tell you where to go and who to be friends with. I want to dictate the terms of our relationship, regardless of how you tell me that impacts you or how you feel about it. We often see them, as we've described, being very possessive. And we'll see abusers, when they talk about the abuse, confusing love and abuse. It's because I love you that I won't let you wear that out. It's because I love you that I won't let you have contact with your friends or family. And really it's about the isolation, but the abuser might talk about, well, it's not good for you and it's better for you to stay home with me and for me to know where you are, and all these different excuses where they try and explain away the abuse as love. But again, it's really important to know that abuse is not love. It can happen in relationships where love exists, but abuse is not love. And using these tactics is not a way to show a victim that the abuser loves or cares about them. We can often see abusers making contradictory statements and behaviors. We see this a lot, particularly when our victims leave. Oftentimes when folks come into our shelter, they get messages from their abuser, I'll change, I'll never act that way again, I promise things will be different. And they will talk about this, but our victims will also often talk to us about they get these promises all the time. It never works out that way. It's really, again, another tactic of power and control. If you come back, I'll change, so that the victim will come back and they can have that power and control. back over the victim. We'll also see abusers externalizing that responsibility for the domestic violence. So finding excuses as to why it's not their fault that they're committing this abuse. So because you wore that outfit, I had to act this way. Because you went out with that friend or family member when I told you not to. So they're, again, putting that responsibility outside of themselves. But it's important to know that the responsibility for the abuse 100% lies with the abuser or the perpetrator. There is nothing that anyone does ever that warrants them experiencing abuse by their partner or another loved one. We also see, again, abusers often denying, minimizing their behaviors, or blaming the victim. So as I mentioned, it's really important to know that when someone is abusive, they are making that choice, and it has nothing to do with anything that the victim has done. 100% of the blame for abuse lies with the abuser, and they make choices when they abuse about who they're abusing, when, where, if they attack an individual, what words and excuses they use, if they destroy property and what property and whose property it is. These are all choices that the abuser is making. And it's important to know that we know with perpetrators, they'll often use the use of substances by themselves, substance abuse issues, mental illness issues, and say, that's the reason why I hurt you. It's because I have this mental health concern. It's because I abuse substances that I'm harming you. But it's important to know that is not an excuse. Using substances or having a mental health diagnosis does not make someone a domestic violence abuser. And we know that because there are many people, and I'm sure in your lives too, who experience mental health issues or who struggle with substance use and who do not harm their partners or other loved ones. So it's really important to know that that is not a valid excuse, and that mental health concerns and substance use concerns do not create abuse and do not create circumstances where someone would abuse someone else. So we've talked a lot about domestic violence, what it looks like, and what victims experience. And so oftentimes when we do that, folks will say, well, why on earth would someone stay, right? If you're experiencing all of these horrible things, why would you stay in this relationship? And there are so many reasons why victims stay and why it's incredibly difficult to leave an abusive relationship. So the first thing to think about is that fear. So again, we talked about abusers are utilizing these tactics, this abuse that we talked about, and fear and intimidation to get the victim to stay. And victims are very afraid of their abusers. We see this time and again. They are afraid of what they will do. They're afraid of the things that they've seen them do. They're afraid for their lives. And so it's very difficult to leave, particularly if you're in a situation where an abuser has told you they will kill you or someone you love if you leave them. It's a very difficult decision to make. We also know in our society, unfortunately, there is some stigma, shame, and blame related to domestic violence and being a domestic violence victim. So it's really difficult, and victims oftentimes are in denial about being a domestic violence victim. They're minimizing the behaviors that are happening. And it's hard to come out and say to somebody, I'm experiencing abuse, when there is this stigma associated with being an abuse victim. But again, as we mentioned, it's never a victim's fault, and they should definitely come forward if they need assistance. We can also see with victims this lack of resources. We talked about, abusers are oftentimes controlling finances, they're isolating victims. And so think about, you have no access to your money, you don't have strong relationships with your friends or family, maybe you're not allowed to work, you don't have another home outside of where you live with your abuser. How do you leave? It's very challenging with absolutely nothing to walk out the door not knowing what's going to happen to you. We often also see victims struggling with their family responsibilities and values. Maybe they share children with that abusive partner. Maybe their cultural values or beliefs tell them that they shouldn't leave a marriage, they should make it work no matter what, that if you have a child with someone, you should stay with them no matter what. And so it can be really hard when you're experiencing abuse to then say, what do I do? I'm being harmed, but my beliefs tell me that I shouldn't go. What should I do? There's also a lot of emotions involved. So, typically when domestic violence is occurring, it's not occurring 100% of the time, right? Victims have gotten into these relationships, they've built a relationship with their perpetrator, they oftentimes love them and care about them. So they want the abuse to stop, but they don't want to lose that connection in that relationship. They have this hope that their abuser can become a new person, especially because the abuser is promising all the time to do better. And oftentimes for a while can sometimes pull back on the abuse so that the victim doesn't leave, and then they continue their tactics again. And we've also talked about the fear and the risk in leaving, and victims often grapple with which is more risky, staying or going. Is this the right time to leave? Am I going to be safe? So we've talked about this, all these issues that victims might face when they leave, all of the struggles that they might be facing in terms of, are they safe? Where can they stay? Can they get a job? Do they have a job? Is their job going to understand if they have to take time off for domestic violence? Maybe their children have been witnesses and now they're involved with Child Protective Services. Maybe because they don't have resources, they now have to navigate to the Department of Social Services, applying for food stamps or cash assistance. Maybe they're now dealing with the police and courts because charges have been filed and the police have been called as a result of domestic violence incidences. Maybe they don't have these relationships they used to have with friends or family because of these isolation tactics. And maybe they're concerned about their pets in the home and what's going to happen. Like we've talked about, it takes victims an average of 7 times to leave. It's very dangerous in that period right after they leave. But we also know from research that after a victim leaves, looking at them a year later, they are safer. Victims are able to leave safely and rebuild their lives successfully without violence. But what they need to do that are resources, support, and help, like what Haven House offers. Like I mentioned, we have a domestic violence shelter for domestic violence victims of all gender identities to give them a safe place to go when they're leaving, to provide them the safety and support during the most dangerous time after they leave, to link them with resources so that they can get their own housing, find employment, work on rebuilding their relationship with their children. We have advocates that will help them navigate the CPS system, advocates that will help them apply for DSS benefits, navigate police and court. So there are resources available to assist victims in the community, and it's really important to link them with those resources so that they can get the support and help that they need to leave a very difficult and challenging situation. So we talked about professional help, right, that Haven House offers. But I also mentioned earlier in the presentation that most folks who disclose their domestic violence are going to disclose it to someone close to them, a friend, a family member, a colleague. So what can you do if someone you know or love discloses domestic violence to you? We always recommend to folks, the very first thing is just to listen and to believe them. We talked about the tactics that abusers utilize and often getting the victim to doubt what they are experiencing. So if someone's telling you they experienced domestic violence, listen to them and tell them that you believe them. This is one of the most important things that we do on our hotline every day when victims call and tell us about their abuse, is to tell them, we believe you. We believe that this is happening to you. It's really important to be non-judgmental, compassionate, and supportive. Like we talked about, there's a lot of shame and guilt and stigma around being a domestic violence victim. So it's going to be really important for the people in your life when they're telling you about this, that you are there for them no matter what, and that you're not passing judgment on them because they've been experiencing this abuse. Because again, it is not their fault, and they did nothing to deserve the treatment that they've been experiencing. It's important to acknowledge how they're feeling. We talked about domestic violence is complicated, and victims are experiencing complicated emotions. They might be telling you that their abuser is hurting them and that they love this person. And it's okay to validate that and say, that makes sense. We do that with victims all the time. It makes sense that you care about this person and you're also afraid. That's okay. It's okay for them to feel whatever it is that they're feeling. It's also really important to respect their choices, even if you don't agree. Your friend might share with you that they're experiencing domestic violence and that they're not ready to leave yet. Remember, we talked about leaving a domestic violence relationship is very dangerous, and victims know their relationship and their situation best. You should trust them that they know what's best and safest. Just because they're not planning to leave right now doesn't mean that they're not making a plan to leave and trying to decide when that's going to be safest. And you can actually be a help with them in that. You can be a part of them developing that safety plan and developing that plan to leave by just maintaining that relationship. Stay engaged with them. Show them that you're not going to be pushed away. Check in with them regularly and see how they're doing, and encourage them to tell other people in their life about the domestic violence so they have other supports and resources as they go through this difficult process. If you don't know what to say to someone, they're experiencing abuse and they need help making a safety plan, making a plan to leave, you don't have to be an expert because there are experts in the community. You can call Haven House 24/7 at 884-6000. You can call yourself, you can call with your loved one. If you're experiencing abuse, you can call us and we'll talk to you about safety planning. We talk to folks who are ready to leave every day, but we also talk to victims every day who aren't ready yet to leave. And we can still provide safety, support, and resources for folks as they go on this journey. And we always tell victims that we're there for them no matter what. We have victims who leave and go back while they're in services with us, and we continue to support them. We continue to maintain our relationship because we know that those connections are so important when they get to the point where they're ready to leave for good and ready to rebuild their life. It can sometimes be really hard to know, what do I say? You might be completely shocked by the person in your life sharing with you that they have experienced domestic violence. So we found these are just some really helpful phrases that you can say to someone that are so powerful for victims to hear, and just really simple, like I talked about, I believe you. Letting them know this isn't their fault, especially because their perpetrator has probably made them feel like they hold some responsibility for the abuse, even though they don't. Letting them know, like we talked about, you're not alone, I'm here for you. Letting them know that there is help available. We learn a lot of times that domestic violence victims don't realize that there's help and support in the community for them. And now, because you're here today, you know that there is. So you can assure them there is help available and I can connect you with those resources. And you can also tell them, I'll try to help you if that's what you want. I can give you these phone numbers. I can be here for you. You can reach out to me. I can support you. These are all really powerful things for DV victims who may feel so alone and so isolated as they're going through this abuse. We also know that there are some things that are not as helpful to say or do when someone tells you that they're experiencing DV. It's really important that you don't automatically call 911 or call the police. A victim might ask you to do that, and then yes, please go ahead and call for help. But just because your friend is on the phone telling you they're experiencing DV, it doesn't mean that you should automatically be hanging up and calling 911 to their house. This might not be a safe option for the victim. And if you're not sure if it is, just ask them. Like we said, victims know their situation. So your friend is on the phone telling you they're experiencing abuse. You can say, do you need me to call the police? Do you need me to call 911? And then follow their lead. We actually do that on our hotline. If we're talking to someone and they are right now in danger, we'll ask them that. Do you want us to call 911? Do you want us to call law enforcement? And then trusting that they know what's safest and best for them. Like we talked about, avoiding using victim blaming language or asking victim blaming questions. So don't ask them about what they did or said or wore or whatever it was that led to the abuse, because again, no matter what the victim did, it didn't warrant them being abused by their partner. We would encourage you just to listen again and be open about what the victim is willing to share, but not try and press too hard for details, and just let them open up as they're ready. We talked about following the victim's lead and really knowing that they know what's best for their safety. So don't try and fix their situation, tell them what to do. Instead, be open. How can I help you? What do you need from me right now? What resources can I connect you with that you're comfortable with right now? And if they don't have those answers, it's again just saying, I'm here for you. You can call me when you're ready. I can help. Don't try and utilize your relationship with the victim to give ultimatums and try and force them to leave. Again, we've talked about their abuser has already been very controlling of them. They've already tried to destroy some of their relationships. It's not going to be helpful if you say, I'm not going to talk to you again if you don't leave him right now. Remember, we talked about it's dangerous and difficult to leave. And if you have someone in your life experiencing domestic violence, they need you and they need your support. So we would recommend you don't use those types of ultimatums. And again, not abandoning or cutting off ties if they choose to stay. Now, no one is saying you should swoop in and try and save them if it's a dangerous situation, but you can be a support and a resource. You can offer to help. You can be, an open and listening ear. And again, you can be prepared with resources to provide to friends or family members. And one really easy thing that we recommend to folks, you don't have to memorize our number, put it in your phone, Haven House 8846,000, because again, it's 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men. You never know who in your life might need that number, and you might be really happy that you saved it one day when you're chatting with your friend, you're texting them and you're telling them this is happening, and you're saying, oh wait, I went to that presentation, I saved that number, let me give this to my friend. We also know that it can be helpful if you're able to see friends or family in person right now and they're disclosing DV, to give them a safe way to call for help. Oftentimes, victims and their perpetrators are utilizing their phone and technology as part of the abuse. They may be monitoring their calls and text messages, so it might be really difficult for victims to reach out for help. So if somebody's with you in person saying, I'm experiencing domestic violence, not just offering them Haven House's number, but saying, do you want to use my phone to call for help, or a phone I have available here to call for help? Because that might be safer for them than making that call. Or maybe you're on the phone and you can do a 3-way call to Haven House so that they get connected to us without having that history show up in their own phone. So in our community, we're really lucky. We have a lot of domestic violence resources and supports available for victims, including Haven House. So you can definitely reach out for help to all these different organizations. But like I said, Haven House is available 24/7. Our domestic violence hotlines, both the chat and the phone hotline, are staffed by trained domestic violence advocates. They do this work every day. And so we tell victims and families and friends, we get these calls every day. So you shouldn't feel embarrassed or afraid. Our advocates are taking these calls, they're talking to victims, they're talking to friends and family, they're talking to other professionals every single day, 24 hours a day. So you can just reach us by, again, calling 8846,000 or chatting us on our website. So I wanted to see, Lauren, if we had any questions come in.
We did, Sarah. Thank you so much. This was fantastic information, and I hope it's going to be very helpful to everyone who's listening and watching right now. A question that did come up was one that was in the registrations initially, and the individual's curious, what is the typical length of stay for someone at Haven House, or what does it look like when somebody does actually come into the shelter? Could you touch upon that?
Absolutely. So when a victim comes into our domestic violence shelter, they come from all different circumstances, like we talked about. Abuse looks like a lot of different things, but typically we have victims coming in a very hurried fashion because they're in a dangerous situation. So oftentimes it's coming in with their clothes on their back. So imagine leaving for work with, for me, it would be like my purse and what I'm wearing, and that's all you have, and you show up at a shelter. So here at Haven House, we have everything available that a victim might need: clothing, toiletries, food, bedding, towels, toys for their children, clothes for their children, literally anything that they might need, because we understand that victims sometimes leave under really hurried circumstances and need that support. Victims can stay in our shelter up to 90 days, and they can qualify for extensions beyond that if they need it. So again, we talked about that 3-month period being the most dangerous. Well, victims can stay with us for 3 months. They can stay here and receive the supports and resources that they need, safety planning, linkages to housing and employment and to our other programs. They can really stabilize and start rebuilding this life for themselves, free of violence. We also keep our doors open. Like we talked about, it takes the victim an average of 7 times. So if the victim comes to us and they choose to go back, we don't say, you can never come back to the domestic violence shelter. When they're leaving, we say, take our number, call us if you need us, if you change your mind, if you need something. And we welcome victims back multiple times if that's what it takes for them to leave their relationship and again, build this life for themselves free of violence.
Absolutely. Sarah, in this era of COVID, when many people are isolated themselves generally from friends and family, what is Haven House doing? What are some of the services that Haven House is offering so that should there be another quarantine again, we're still available to help? Can you touch upon that?
Yeah, we understand right now it's much more challenging for victims because they are more isolated, and oftentimes they're being forced to stay under these stay-at-home orders at home with their abusers. So, during this time, we've all typically been told home is the safest place for you, but for domestic violence victims, that isn't usually the case. So with our DV victims, we are doing safety planning through our chat and our hotline, even if that means that safety planning while they have to quarantine at home. So we talk to them about what are safe options for them, what resources are still available to them, how can we plan for them to keep themselves safe, including safety planning around their own home environment if that's what we need to do. we know that folks are more isolated from friends and family, but again, trying to be in contact, but also being aware that technology is utilized as a part of domestic violence. So victims may have chats, text messages, phone calls monitored by their abuser and maybe more present, but we are offering services still to victims. Like I said, they can contact us. We are offering all of our services in person and remotely. So if victims don't feel safe or can't get to us in person to receive any of our services, they can contact us via video or telephone, and can still access our hotline and all of our services and resources.
Absolutely. A question did come in about abusers. Is Haven House doing anything to maybe monitor abusers that survivors have been in touch with, or how does Haven House provide safety around that?
Around abusers with regards to folks in the shelter?
Exactly.
Yeah, so our domestic violence shelter is at an undisclosed location. You may have realized that if you tried to Google us and find out where we were, our address is not publicized, and that's on purpose. We really want to create an undisclosed location so that victims are safe here. We do have robust security here at Haven House. We have a security system and cameras. All of our doors are locked. Our shelter is double locked to get in. We've never had abusers get into our building in the 41-year history of Haven House. So it is really safe here, and we have also really great partnerships with our local law enforcement. So if we do have a situation where an abuser or another unsafe individual has come to our property, we call for help and the police respond very quickly to us here. But we feel like, the planning that we do with victims, they feel safe here, which is the most important thing to us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another question that came through was in regards to specialty services. So, for example, those who are LGBTQ, immigrants and refugees, maybe even male victims, what services are available to those specific populations?
Yeah, so we provide general domestic violence services. We don't have a specialized population that we work with. Aside from, the majority of the cases that we see are intimate partner violence, but we do also assist in family violence, dating violence cases. So we do see a large range of folks, and we don't have a specialty population here, but there are resources in the community that do specialize in working with specific subsets of the victim population. So some examples of that are the International Institute of Buffalo, which specializes in working with immigrant and refugee survivors of domestic violence, and also survivors of domestic violence who are also victims of human trafficking. There's Rahama, or Resources and Help Against Marital Abuse, that works with Muslim victims of domestic violence in our community. So there are some specialized resources available within Erie County. But here at Haven House, we do serve all victims of all gender identities and backgrounds.
All right. Sarah, could you talk about what services are available when a survivor does leave our shelter, and how they can still be connected?
With Haven House when they leave?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So all of our victims who are in our shelter are eligible for our non-residential services as well. So when they're here in the shelter, they do get assigned a domestic violence advocate who works with them through the whole process. They'll safety plan with them. They'll talk to the victim about what do they need, how can we support them. Haven House does what we call empowerment-based services. So what that means is we follow the lead of the victim, just like I talked about during this presentation, if it's a friend or family member, So we follow the victim's lead, what's best for them, what's safest for them, and then we connect them with the resources, supports, and services that they need to meet those goals and do what's best for them. So their advocate meets with them regularly to talk about what are their long-term goals, what services and supports do they need, linking them with housing, with mental health counseling, with domestic violence counseling, with advocacy. Do they need to file charges and need assistance with that? We'll work with them. Do they need to file for an order of protection? We'll work with them around that. So it's really based on what the victim's own needs are. And then when they leave our shelter, they're able to stay connected to our non-residential services. So they can be connected to parenting after violence if they need support around their parenting, economic empowerment if they're struggling with financial abuse or the ramifications of that. They can be linked with DV counseling or support groups. They can be linked with legal and court advocacy if they're experiencing filing charges or going through the legal system as a result of their domestic violence. So really, we just try and work with the survivor about what their needs are and what services best meet their needs.
Absolutely. Sarah, I'm looking through and I don't think I see any other questions from anyone in the audience today. I'll just remind folks that, again, this presentation is recorded, so it will be available to you. We're also happy to provide the slides as well. We do have a survey that's available after this presentation. It will be sent to all who participated. Again, Haven House's website is linked in the chat, so do feel free to
Sorry,
access
I
that.
didn't mean to interrupt, Lauren. There are a couple of questions I see in the chat that I will definitely just answer quickly, if you don't mind.
Of course, go right ahead.
So the first question is, do we know of any support groups that are virtual and available to survivors? So we are actually at Haven House utilizing virtual support groups at this time. So there are virtual support group resources available. Our hotline is also aware of other virtual resources that are currently available throughout the state for domestic violence victims. So if you're looking for folks who are hoping to link with virtual services, you can definitely give us a call. We had another question, is there always space available at Haven House, or is there a waiting period? So Haven House is a 36-bed shelter, as I mentioned, so we do have a restriction on how many folks can stay here with us at the facility. On average, our capacity runs at about 90%, but it fluctuates up and down. So really day to day, it's different on if we have space or not. If a victim calls and we have space, we'll find a way to bring them in safely to our shelter. If we don't have space and they still need to flee their home and find a safe place to go, we will work with them to connect them with either other out-of-county domestic violence shelters or homeless shelters here within our own county if they feel like leaving Erie County isn't the best or safest option for them. But it really changes day to day. We have folks come in and discharge from shelter all of the time. So what we recommend to folks is that if they have a need for shelter, they should call. If someone's asking specifically about, or if the question is specifically about today, right now, we do have 2 openings in our shelter. So if you know someone who's in need and you're hoping to refer them, you can have them call our hotline. And then asking about wait lists. So Haven House does not maintain a wait list. So folks call, and if there's a live availability, we work to intake them and bring them into the shelter if they're eligible. If there is no availability, we'll refer them out immediately for resources. If a victim is really set on, I only want to leave if I can come to Haven House specifically, we encourage them to call back, and we link them with other resources and supports available to help them with safety planning and resources and linkages to services. So we'll talk to the victims again about what's best and safest for them, but we do not maintain a waiting list.
Again, it's all about safety and making sure that the survivor is able to come to the shelter as safely as possible and to leave as safely as possible too, with the support and resources in their toolkit. But again, that number that we have is 884-6000. That is our hotline. It is available 24/7, like Sarah did mention. I do want to thank everyone for joining us today. I think we ended a little bit early, but you have some time for the rest of the day. I want to remind everyone that our next webinar will be next Thursday at noon. It is the second webinar in our Domestic Violence Awareness Month speaker series, and it will be a presentation with Amy Jaworski with SPCA. We'll be talking about what the link is between abuse of humans and abuse of animals. So it'll be a really interesting conversation. Again, we thank everyone very much for joining us today for our very first webinar, and hope that you'll come back next time. Thanks again, everyone.